Welcome to the Design Thinker podcast, where we explore the theory and practice of design. Hosted by me, Donnie, and
me, Peter.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode. In this episode, we continue on our three-part series looking at the lenses of design thinking. To refresh our memories, the three lenses are feasibility, viability, and desirability. This week, we're going to be diving into viability. So let's dive into the conversation. Hey, Pete.
Hi, Danny. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you. So I think today we're going to talk about the viability lens.
The viability lens, yeah. Looking forward to this one. I thought I would I'd look up the definition again and start there.
Yep.
This is an interesting one, though. I've the definition of viable rather than viability. So that this one says it's an adjective, and the meaning is capable of working successfully. Feasible is the next word in the definition. It says capable of working successfully, semicolon, feasible. Now, I think we and our listener should mentally erase the word feasible from our definition of viable, because for us that's a whole different lens. So capable of working successfully. That's my noise for erasing feasible in my brain. But then the example is the proposed investment was economically viable. So reading the word feasible gave me a little bit of an anxiety spike, and I read that next sentence. The proposed investment was economically viable, and I kind of had a bit of a sigh of relief, because that's exactly, in my mind, what our definition of viable or viability is kind of focused in on, right?
The definition that I found that I quite like is ability to survive or live successfully.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's further down in this definition around the kind of biology. So that before we go on, and maybe slightly more seriously than my mental erasing of the word feasible, so to make a distinction between aspect of viability and our feasibility lens. Feasible. I think it is important because it comes up in the conversation of these three lenses. What is the difference between feasible and viable? And for me, it's partly about choosing the definition that's most useful. But yeah, what do you think about that surviving successfully in relation to, or how is it distinct from feasible?
So for me, feasibility is about, is it something we can conceivably do? That's what we talked about last time.
Yeah.
Whereas viability is it something that can survive for, some amount of time?
Yeah. Okay. Nice.
So I know in the context of design thinking and designing products and services, we often viability is looked at in terms of commercial viability or financially viable. I do think I think that's a very narrow way of looking at that lens.
Okay. I'm glad you think that, because I'm hoping you can help me expand my my thinking. To share with you my thoughts had been relatively narrow around asking the question in our viability lens space, is this commercially viable? But actually, I think it's more helpful to think about the question, is it economically viable? Because sometimes the interest isn't solely commercial, but we can come back to that. But yeah, I'm really interested to hear your broader thinking around viability.
Well, I think from an organization perspective, we want to think about it. So obviously, if you are a business and you're creating a product or service, the economical or financial viability is important. So I'm not dismissing that. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, though, I think we have to think about, and I always struggle with, is this a viable, or is it more around alignment? But is it viable for our overall strategy, right? So all organizations have a strategy or mission or vision, all of those things that explain who we are as an organization. So I think we have to look at solutions and align them back to, does this align to our strategy? Does it align to our vision? Does it align to the goal that we're trying to get to? And along the sides of that, along those sides, I think reputation is another thing we need to consider. Like, is this solution is it viable to our reputation? Is it going to enhance it? Is it going to sustain it? Is it a thing that we're going to do that might get us a quick little lift, but long term, it's going to have a negative impact on us? The other one that's becoming more and more important is sustainability. And here I'm specifically talking about environmentally sustainable. More and more, this is something that organizations are starting to consider. We're all starting to feel some of the impacts of what our climate is doing. And so that needs to be part of that viability lens, is what we're doing viable for our environment.
Yeah, cool. And then I was just looking at some notes from our conversation around feasibility, and we kind of brought up them politically and ethically as two separate things. And I think, when we talked about it in the terms of feasibility, and we started to think, well, actually, maybe those are more in the realm of viability rather than feasibility. I don't know if you've had any more thoughts on that. But yeah, I guess right now we're talking about what is our definition of viability in this context, right? Rather than why is it important, or how we actually think about or ensure something's viable.
I wonder if the question that we need to ask then is around, is this solution enhancing? Right? Does it enhance our financial situation? Does it enhance our strategy? Does it enhance our sustainability goals? Does it?
Yeah, it's a nice lead-on question, and actually, that's a really important question, and sometimes one that could be easily missed. And especially if you combine it with something you just mentioned, which is around long-term viability or survivability, because sometimes we can, in any aspect of our life, we can do something that's, potentially a quick fix, or it gives us a short-term boost, but the effort required to keep that kind of short-term boost going or plateauing something that new level isn't actually feasible, not possible to keep it going. So yes, it's like, does this enhance in all or some of these dimensions we talked about, and does it enhance it over the long term?
Organizations are very good at forgetting the long term. I often find that what we do is we come up with a lot of short-term things and hope that we can stitch them together and make a long-term impact. And that's not to minimize, there are trade-offs. Sometimes you have to make trade-offs between the long term and the short term. That's just practicalities of life. However, I think we're starting to lose our ability to focus on the long term because we become so focused on the short term. And I think that's where this viability lens really helps us push our thinking. Okay, well, we'll get this in the short term, but what does that look like when it goes out 3, 5, 6, 8, 9 years?
Yeah, nice. Okay, so we've got emerging here then. Viability is a number of these different kind of questions or domains, like economic, strategic, reputational viability. Almost the most important now is sustainable viability or environmental sustainability. And what we're talking about is the long-term viability. So that's helping us get clearer on the what. Maybe we've already started to answer the why is it important, but why is this important? What would happen if we didn't consider viability?
Well, if we kind of look at each of these lenses, each of these kind of subcategories that sit in the lens, if we don't consider we could end up investing a lot of money, time, energy, effort on something that we're not going to get a return on. We could end up investing all of those resources in something that's going to be damaging to an organization's reputation, drive them away from their strategy.
Yeah, from a reputational point of view, it could be that it's actually, as we talk about it, think about it, it's really simple. It's like if you don't think about viability, or you accidentally deliver something that isn't viable in the long term, then the consequences are almost the opposite of, you'll damage your reputation, just continue your list, you'll potentially damage the environment.
And even just like the long-term sustainability in terms of like, how do we keep this going, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a good analogy to think about this is like, you have all these like fad diets, right? So people decide, oh, I want to lose a bunch of weight quickly and I'm going to go do some, I don't know, where you just eat cabbage all day or whatever crazy thing it is. It's not sustainable, right? And at some point, you're going to need to eat something other than cabbage. And like, is that weight loss going to be sustainable on this thing that was a short-term fix? So that's the analogy that always comes to mind for me when I think about viability. Is this something that can be sustained? Like, is this a cabbage diet or is it more of a lifestyle?
Okay, nice. Is this a cabbage diet? And you, sorry, I interrupt you. You were, rather than, is this a kind of an overall lifestyle adjustment, so which takes into account all of our, previous habits? Are what comes to mind for me when we in the viability is like you mentioned it as well, is fundamentally, will we be able to get back more than we put in? And then the kind of addition to that is in the long term. So in the case of fundamentally in the case of a product or a service, which is being, if we are a commercial for-profit organization, then it does come down to the commercial question of, can we sell this for a higher price than it costs us to make it, deliver it, etc. Although, as I say that, I'm thinking, well, maybe not, because actually there's, such things as loss leaders.
But that's where it comes back to strategy, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes taking the loss up front has a payoff in the long term.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes a loss leader is just a loss. But this is where I think another thing that you're bringing up here is that this is where we have to think about the solutions we create in context to other things that exist in the organization.
Yeah.
And again, I think this is the viability lens is where it allows us to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I've just literally just written down the word system as well. So, thinking of the organization or as a system, which in itself is within part of a system, and you can kind of keep going and keep going. But yes, that was a bit of a light bulb that brightened for me there. Yeah, you could be designing, in our case, or working on a particular product or service, and it is both easier and sometimes necessary to really just focus on that particular product and service. But it's one of these kind of contradictory situations where you also at the same time, or the very next thing you need to do is take a step back and, okay, how does this fit into the context? How does this fit into the strategy, and also fit into the organizational system and the kind of all the other systems that whatever you're designing is part of? This is really helpful, actually, thinking much more broadly about viability.
Well, I think all of these lenses have much deeper meaning. Like, I think the 3-circle diagram and the 3 words, they're a great visual and they're a good quick thing we can use, but there is deeper meaning to each of these lenses that you kind of have to dig into and understand to really be able to execute on them well.
Yeah, and that means, not sure if pausing is the right word, but certainly investing time and effort into these questions that we're asking, and into seeking the answers to these questions. And I guess the word pausing comes to mind because I think of pausing to consider, rather than kind of running ahead without thinking about any of these things, which is often because of the short-term thinking that we're it's a system we're becoming part of, which is more and more short-term. Often we feel driven to, and either unable to pause, or really having to fight against the kind of flow to pause and take time to think about what are we doing here? What is in this case, what are these viability questions?
So I think so far we've defined viability. So what is viability? Do you want to recap that for us?
Viability is it's capable of working successfully and capable of surviving successfully over the long term.
And then we talked about some topics to think about within viability. So financial, economical, commercial, that money aspect, strategy in terms of like, how does this align with the strategy of where we're trying to go, sustainability in terms of environmental context, reputation. One thing we haven't talked about yet that we did talk about last week, and we decided to park, was around political, social, ethical. Maybe we unpack that a little bit. Do we need to consider political in the viability lens?
Well, let's unpack that, because last time when we were discussing feasibility, we decided it belonged in viable. So, and the same with ethical, and with social, we kind of played with the idea of it. Maybe that belongs in desirable. But let's work through each of those three things actually, and then I'm keen to come back to this idea. Once we've done that, let's come back to this idea of the system and where that kind of sits. So political viability. I'm trying to think of some examples of things that might be desirable and feasible, but for some reason they're not viable from a political point of view. Maybe we talked about this last time in video. Some features of some social networks are essentially either turned off or not available or diminished in some countries, like China, for example. The features of some social networks, Facebook, Instagram, etc. They're just not available to people who use those apps in that country because politically they're not permitted to, because the government there has a different perspective on what its citizens can and can't communicate with each other compared to other countries. Is that a viable example, or obviously a non-viable example?
I think so. When you said political, my brain was going somewhere completely different.
Oh, okay. Good. All right, good. Let's get it. Okay, good. Let's get into this then. Where was your brain going?
I think my brain was going like, if you are a government and you're deciding on creating services and thinking through, like, in this political environment, is this service that we're going to develop, is it viable in this? So that's kind of where my brain was going with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could it be both?
It could be both. But then what I come back to is, recently I was watching a documentary on the passing of the Equal Rights Act.
Okay.
In the US, and how so many politicians were at the time. So this was, I think, the 60s, 70s. At the time, so many politicians were advised to not touch it.
Okay.
So I think about that, like, at the time, it wasn't politically viable if you were looking to stay in government or be voted in, or whatever the outcome was. But that didn't mean that it wasn't something that should have been done. Like, we look back on it and we go, oh, the Equal Rights Act, obviously, well, most of us at least, obviously that's something that should have been done. So I think that's where I struggle with this political one, because from the way that I'm looking at it politically, it goes down a different path. Whereas I think where you're looking at it is, are the products and services we design, do they have features that may not align to the legalities of some countries?
Yeah, yes, and those, that kind of legality, the legislation comes from, in some countries, directly from the political. Yeah, I think it can. Well, maybe the point is that you're exploring the viability of your design, whatever it may be, whether it's a large scale system design or a small scale kind of product or service. Then consider the political. I wonder, do you remember last time we talked about, it's a great opportunity to build your cross-functional team when you're thinking about desirable, feasible, viable. It helps you bring in the right expertise. I'm trying to think in the organization of who would you bring in? Who would be good? What sort of person or what sort of role or skill set experience would be good to bring in and help with the the political.
Actually, now that you're framing it up that way, I wonder, sorry,
Yeah.
this is going down a
Yeah.
little bit of a rabbit warren.
Well, that's
Is
all right. I like a good diverse and tangent rabbit warren. Yeah.
Is this more about having some like global contextual awareness,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we were designing, okay, I'll pick this one because it's what comes to mind at the moment. Let's say that we work for a travel company and we're designing trip packages.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go ahead and take the bet that at the moment, travel to Jerusalem isn't very appealing. If we didn't have the awareness of what was happening around the world, we may be designing things that just don't land well.
Yes, and another example that came to mind actually, it's it's probably similar to the social network one. But if we think about Uber, some of the conflict it's found itself in with governments, either national governments or more often than not city or state governments, around how they're allowed to operate, in what way their Uber drivers are considered. Are they employees or are they self-employed? Are they contractors, etc.? I wonder. So that this is like, for me, that not to dismiss your point about travel and consideration of where is acceptable to travel to, but this is kind of the for me, this is like the political viability question. And if as we've seen with Uber and other organizations like them, they've been involved in similar conversations, legal tussles. And I've said that word legal, maybe it's feasibility, but I think there is something in this long term, because we've defined viability as a long term survival. So initially, let's take Uber as an example, welcomed with open arms by 90% of the population, including, I'm sure, the politicians that use in these cities that use their services. But as different forces came into play, politicians discovered that it's not 100% upside, and they had some people who can choose to either vote for them or not vote for them, in the form, in this case, of a whole bunch of taxi drivers who are up in arms about this competition being introduced. And therefore, the politicians pay attention to the people in their city who vote for them versus the big corporation that can't, but does have influence in other ways. Yeah, I guess maybe this might be an example of, in the short term, Uber didn't come across that hurdle, that obstacle, that barrier to their continued success, aka viability, but they did have to deal with that too.
I don't know. I feel like, to me, this comes back more to legal than political.
Okay, but what about the question of the voters? Isn't that what politics is in a democracy?
So if we go back, if we take the example of Uber specifically, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a company scales their products and services across different jurisdictions, they have to consider the legal implications of that, because different countries have different rules and laws.
Mm-hmm.
That is a question, to me, that's a question around feasibility. Like, could we feasibly scale this solution? Or is it specific to a certain geography? And if it is, that's okay. We just have to be deliberate that there's a limitation to the feasibility of this. But coming back to your questions around the voters in a democracy, I guess for a for-profit organization, there's the element of, well, we have to make sure we're following the rules. So legally, is it feasible? And then there is we have a ethical obligation to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And we all know from history, not all organizations take their ethical responsibilities. The degree to which they take those responsibilities vary. So I'm really struggling with this political one, because I don't know how it sits in with design.
Yeah.
Of products.
I'm a bit too. Yeah, same. Maybe it's let's let's tee up an episode with somebody who can help us think it through, who's got more. Maybe that's what I was thinking, like who in an organization would you engage, would you bring in to help, the design team think through these questions? And I wonder, companies have external affairs people, maybe they would be helpful. I'm interested in it. I think it's an interesting area to think about and get
I
into.
definitely think it's interesting. And I like the idea of a future episode with someone that knows more about it than we do.
Yeah.
I will say this, and then we can move on to the next thing. I do think as designers, we do have to have a certain level of awareness of what is happening politically.
Yes, agreed. It's our responsibility to consider all of these things and to make sure that a team we're involved in, not even leading, but a team we're involved in and helping, I think it's our responsibility to make sure that they are considering each of these things, all of these things we talked about, no matter which lens we happen to decide they fit into on that particular day, in that particular situation. Because, we've seen the consequences of that not happening. Yeah. Oh, now we could get really political, but we won't. Let's get into that in another episode. The politics of design. What else did we have on our list?
So we had ethical.
Yeah.
So we talked last time about how legality was about, can we do it? Ethics is about, should we do it?
Yeah.
So how does that play into design work?
Well, as a designer or as a design team is from a legal point of view and from all other considerations of feasibility, you can have a social media app that is, to quote Jake Knapp from the Google Sprint book, and Make Time is his other book, describes it as an infinity pool, POOL, for those who, my accent is not clear, but an infinity pool, what he means by that is, you can scroll, like you could sit on Facebook or many other apps and just scroll, if you're able to stay up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it would just continuous. So that's feasible, but is it ethical to do that with the knowledge that human beings respond to
the dopamine response?
The dopamine response to the kind of random, sporadic newness of that infinite scrolling of information. Knowing that, so with that knowledge, is it ethical to do that? Because you know that you can have somebody who's in a particular circumstance literally sit there for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and maybe not literally in that case, but for a long time, for such a time that's damaging to their mental health. So, knowing all that, is it ethical to do that? I mean, it's seems to be viable because it's a way to keep people's attention and therefore be able to sell advertising. But is it ethical?
Well, and this is why I think when we think about viability, we have to think about ethics, because it has to be part of the consideration of viability.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you end up with things like that that can be quite damaging. And I think there is...
Isn't it me that's usually a little bit understated in my quite damaging? Yes, it can be quite damaging.
I think I'm starting to pick up on the New Zealand British way of saying things in a very polite way.
Yeah.
So it can be very damaging.
Yeah.
How do we, and I think that there's a lot of danger in, I think that ethics, or sorry, design has come under a lot of scrutiny around ethics. And I think also, like in my work, I combine behavioral science and design thinking. And there are all sorts of ways that can go wrong. And I have a lot of fears about people doing a little bit of reading about behavioral science and then using it in very unethical ways. And sometimes that can happen unintentionally. Right? So there is a danger in as people start to use design more, as people start to use behavioral science more, that we start to create things that can be very harmful to people.
Yeah.
We have to bring ethics into the conversation, into our design work, into our decision making more and more and more, if we want to be good design practitioners.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think it's not easy, especially given, I guess, the forces that we're trying to harness, and also the forces that oftentimes we're kind of can be going against the flow. Let's put it that way. In an organization or in a system. So yeah, it's not easy. Imagine a future where designers or actually, well, imagine anybody in any organization, part of your contract is like the Hippocratic Oath. It's like, first do no harm. But that's certainly a question that we should be asking. It's a bit like a NASA countdown space launch. As we're going through it, we've got a checklist of things, and right at the top of that checklist or right at the bottom, depending on how we're counting up or counting down to the launch, something is first do no harm, framed into a is this doing any harm question. If the answer to that is either yes or not sure, then let's just pause the countdown and again, pause that word. Let's think about and explore and try and really expand our thinking to understand what the consequences of what we're about to change in the world with our design and our implementation of that design. Let's think beyond just the immediate and what chain of events might it unfurl. First do no harm.
In research ethics, there's this concept of, we have to accept that all research has some level of risk. Anything we do has some level of risk. But what you're always taught is you have to figure out, are the benefits of doing this research worth the risk? So the benefits always have to outweigh the risk by a considerable amount. So it can't be a marginal amount, right? We can't harm people to do research, and then what they get out of it is marginal. And I think this is an important thing to come back to, particularly as we start to, so we know that all design work has to start with some sort of discovery. We have to go out there and engage with consumers. But we have to consider, is that what, is the stuff that we're going to go ask people to engage in, if it is going to re-traumatize them in some way, is it worth doing it? And are we actually going to do something that will make things better for those people? A real life example of this is, one organization that I worked with wanted to go out and do interviews with people that have experienced a very traumatic loss due to a weather event.
Okay.
Which can be very traumatizing for people to relive and tell their story. And I kept asking, okay, this is going to be a very traumatizing thing for people to talk about. What are we prepared to do? Like, one, why do we really need to do this? Is there some other way we can get to this?
Yeah. And
when we do this, is what we're going to do differently, or is the thing that we're going to create, is it going to be worthwhile for people to have to sit through and talk through this thing? Because for me, it wasn't worthwhile doing until there was a commitment and a very clear understanding of what we were looking to understand, why we needed to understand it, and how, by doing this, we're going to make something that's better for that situation.
Yeah.
Because it's pretty crappy if you go out there and you ask people to, share an experience that was painful, and then you're like, oh, well, that's great, but there's really nothing we can do.
Yeah. It's the word selfish comes to mind. It's extremely selfish. The opposite of desirable. as well. And yeah, interesting that again, empathy comes to mind. Like we talk about empathy and being empathetic. Yeah, we should build that into our thinking, our considerations, long before start engaging with the people we think we're going to be able to help, or the people we're interested in finding out more about. Yeah, thank you for that. That's it's an important point. Yeah, so again, first do no harm. Like again, that word pause comes up in my mind all the time. It's just like just pause and think and have a conversation.
Well, I think in modern life,
Mm.
we do not create time for reflection. We spend very little time thinking about what are we doing and what impact is it having? Because I think we all get, particularly in organizations, we get so hung up on the delivering of the thing. And I think I've talked about this before. Like we get so hung up on the delivering of the thing that we kind of lose the plot of like, why are we doing it in the first place?
Yeah.
But you can't do good design work if you're not making time to reflect. And that's not a let's reflect at the end. It has to be a daily practice of, and it doesn't have to be a 3-hour exercise either, right? Like there's research that shows 15 minutes of reflection can increase productivity by like 70% or some crazy number. Because when we pause, as you said, and we think about what it is that we're doing and the impact that it's having, we can start to tweak our path.
Yeah, it's like a cycle. The cycle that pops comes into my mind. I use it quite often as this plan, execute, debrief, and learn. So we're talking about the debriefing and learning, and that can be something we do for ourselves. It doesn't, like you say, it doesn't take long. I agreed that we can find ourselves falling into the trap of not doing that, just continuing down a path because we're driven to deliver, or in some way seduced by that kind of end goal of delivering something.
And don't get me wrong, delivering is important. I am a personality, so I'm very much goal motivated.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, what you're delivering, the quality of what you're delivering, the impact of what you're delivering also matters.
Yeah, just as much, I think. Just as much. It's like having those have equal weight. Some of the language.
To me, saying, "Hey, here's this half thought about crappy product, but it's on time."
Yeah. No, that's fundamentally clashes with my values, and but some words you've just used have really just shifted maybe my thinking around, or given me an additional way to think about these lenses. Maybe you thought about it already, but whenever I've thought about these lenses before, I've thought about them as almost like a question framework, and like, is this desirable? Is this feasible? Is this viable? But what you've just said helps me think, actually, we could set this as like a goal setting or objective framework, and we are going to do something that is desirable, feasible, and viable. That is our goal. And then you flip that into, well, how might we make this as desirable, feasible, and viable as we possibly can? And I know that might seem like either a moment for some people, or a subtle shift, but actually I think for me it's a really helpful, just a different way of thinking about it, and just a way that you could kick off a piece of work to go, right, this is our challenge. Like as we go on, we're going to continue to hone this idea through different cycles of doing and thinking, but our overall objective is to make this thing as desirable, feasible, and viable as we possibly can.
Absolutely. I mean, to me, when someone says, oh, we're taking a human-centered approach or a design thinking approach to something, what my mind is saying, okay, we're going to create something that's desirable, feasible, viable.
Yeah.
Maybe all of us need to get a little bit more explicit in saying that or stating that when we do that. And on the flip side, I like framing them as what if questions.
Yeah.
I also like framing them as yes, no questions, as a way of holding themselves accountable, right? So when we say, is this desirable? Will people want it? That's our way of to be able to answer that, we have to have gone out and done the discovery work.
Yes.
We have to have gone out and done the empathy work.
Yeah.
So I think, so it's kind of 3 layers, right? One is explicitly as a goal, like we are going to create something that's desirable, feasible, viable. Then there is the framing it in the how might we make this desirable, feasible, viable. And then there is the accountability aspect of it. Is it desirable? Is it, and framing those in yes or no questions so that we can hold ourselves accountable.
Yeah, nice. And that kind of fits in with my, that checklist idea of like, let's not, if the answer to any of these questions is no, then we're not going to do this.
Okay. I think,
Go on.
I don't think if the answer to any of those questions is no, I don't think we kind of throw the whole, baby and bathwater out. I think for anything that's a no, we need to understand why. And then I think it goes back to a how might we.
Okay. Continuing the cycle, in other words, like iterating. Yeah.
Because I think sometimes we have to remember that and this is where I struggle with frameworks and models and stuff like that and processes, is that it paints the world as being very idealistic. And the real world is not idealistic. And sometimes we do have to do something that doesn't, outside of breaking laws and harming people, which is always a no, to be clear. Sometimes we do have to do something that might not quite meet the mark of feasibility yet, but we have to go out with it. And then we have to figure out how to make it more feasible. Again, as long as we're not harming people and we're not breaking any laws. And this is where the idea of really being committed to prototyping and continuous improvement is really important, because we don't live in an idealistic world. So we always have to balance these frameworks that we talk about with reality. An example of this is, look, we might be working on a solution and we have X amount of budget. We get down the path and we realize, well, actually, if we're going to do this, we actually need more budget. But we can't get more budget till we can prove that we could do something with the budget we have.
Yeah.
So that's an example of where we might have to make some trade-offs, again, as long as we're not breaking any laws or harming people, where we might have to, deliver something as a proof point so that we could get the funding to really push the solution that meets all the check boxes, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like and also in doing so, you start to discover whether something is actually viable in reality, or not. Yeah.
I also want to add, design thinking always has this, I always get these comments around like, oh, it's just a fluffy thing, or it's this or that. It's about making pretty things.
Yeah. It's about Post-it notes and
and Sharpies and
brainstorming and
What I really enjoyed about the past 2 conversations, so feasibility and viability, is really teasing out that design work is also this. It's about thinking about the practical implications of bringing something into the real world and making it work in the real world. So it's not just the fluff. It's
I always think of and describe it as, this is like, it's like really it's like the tough like you say the word fluff, but on the and it is also, because it is about ideas and generating those and using our imagination and creating, but it is yin and yang of it is that, and also the actual reality, the hard-nosed reality, and making those tough decisions about, this thing would be it's highly desirable, but there's no way we can do it or keep it going. So it's just, we can do it. And for me, it's it's a bit like the 2 hemispheres of our brain working in conjunction, but there being this continuous kind of balance or conversation and cycling through these questions of desirable, feasible, and viable until we come up, ideally we come up with the right balance of each of them. But I agree. I try and emphasize that point that it's not just the so-called fluff, but it's also the tough fluff and tough.
Or it's about making the fluffy practical. So that was a good chat. I really enjoyed that.
Me too. Yeah, that was great, Tony. Thank you for giving me lots to think about. Do you want to give us a recap, and then give us a recap, then ask me what my takeaway is?
So let's see. We talked about what is viability. So I think we kind of landed on a definition around succeeding in the long term. Is it something that can be successful in the long term? We looked at the different categories of things we have to look at when we're thinking viability. So financial strategy, sustainability, reputation. We had a very long circular conversation about politics, and we decided to put a pin on that and get some expertise to weigh on that because we were out of our depth. And then we talked about ethics and how we have to start bringing ethics more into the conversation of design. And then we talked about some practical examples. We talked about how do we frame up thinking about the three lenses. So it's a goal, it helps facilitate the how, and it can serve as an accountability checklist for good solution as well. Yeah, I think have I missed anything?
No, I think that's a great summary. Oh, apart from cabbage soup.
Cabbage soup. I have not tried the cabbage soup diet, by the way. Have you?
No. No.
I like my cabbage raw and crunchy.
Oh, I like my cabbage in a stir fry. We've discovered a new icebreaker. How do you like your cabbage?
And what kind of cabbage?
Yeah, it's a replacement for Myers-Briggs.
There we go. So
what
are you taking away?
Yeah, what's my takeaway? That thing actually finished off on, which is these three layers. So we've got the three lenses, and we combine them with these three layers of framing things up as goals, as how might we use, and then finally, most importantly, the accountability framing. And I'm going to play around with how to visualize that, and also how to visualize a set of questions that start to explore these different aspects of feasibility, viability, and desirability too. What's your takeaway?
An action item for you.
Yeah.
I'd love to see that when you pull that together, Pete.
I'll share my first prototype with you.
Cool. My takeaway is actually what kind of related, just solidifying that idea that we need to be more explicit, that when we say we're taking a human-centered approach, what we're really saying is we're going to create something that's desirable, feasible, and viable. And then how we can use these lenses to facilitate the process and also hold ourselves accountable. That came out of a question or a pondering you had.
Oh, a valuable pause and reflection moment. Thanks for helping me feel good about that.
That is, we often like to have real life examples, and that was a real life example of pausing and reflecting.
Cool.
And the impact that it can have. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, today.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
Be sure to check us out next week when we talk about desirability.
Yeah, looking forward to that one.
Me too. Awesome. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Danny.
See you later.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.